The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky terrain as 8-year-old Isabella Cruz played near her family's remote ranch house, her laughter echoing across the vast desert landscape. It was July 15th, 2009, and the temperature had already climbed past 110 degrees by noon. Her parents, Miguel and Carmen Cruz, had moved to this isolated property outside Yuma 3 years earlier, seeking a quiet life away from the chaos of Phoenix. The nearest neighbor lived 12 miles away, and the closest town was a dusty collection of buildings that barely qualified as civilization. Isabella had always been drawn to adventure, her curious nature leading her to explore every crevice and canyon within walking distance of their home. That afternoon, while her mother prepared lunch and her father repaired fence posts in the back pasture, Isabella wandered further than usual, chasing a roadrunner through the mesquite brush and towering saguaro cacti. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a moonscape of red rock formations and ancient geological wonders that had captivated the little girl since the family's arrival. The harsh beauty of the Sonoran Desert was both magnificent and treacherous, with temperatures that could kill within hours and terrain that had claimed countless lives throughout history. The Cruz family had chosen this remote location specifically for its isolation and natural beauty. Miguel worked as a ranch hand for several local property owners, while Carmen cleaned houses in Yuma 3 days a week. Their modest income was supplemented by a small herd of cattle and Carmen's vegetable garden, which thrived despite the challenging climate thanks to an underground water source that had attracted settlers to the area for centuries. Isabella loved helping her mother tend the tomatoes and peppers and spent countless hours playing elaborate games of make-believe among the desert plants and rock formations that surrounded their property. The morning of Isabella's disappearance had begun like any other summer day. Carmen prepared breakfast while listening to Spanish-language radio from across the border, the familiar sounds of regional Mexican music providing a comforting backdrop to the family's daily routine. Miguel left early to check on cattle at a neighboring ranch, promising to return by noon for lunch. Isabella spent the morning reading picture books in the shade of their covered porch, occasionally venturing into the yard to play with Rex, the family's border collie, who served as both companion and guardian in the isolated landscape. If you're enjoying this mysterious story, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. Now, let's continue with Isabella's story. When Carmen called for lunch at 1:30 p.m., only silence answered her. The family's border collie, Rex, began pacing nervously by the front door, whimpering in a way that made Carmen's stomach tighten with instinctive dread. Miguel dropped his tools and joined the search, calling Isabella's name until his voice grew hoarse. The desert seemed to swallow their desperate shouts, returning only the haunting whistle of wind through ancient rock formations. The silence was particularly unnerving because Isabella was typically very responsive to her parents' calls, having been taught from an early age about the dangers of wandering too far from home in such an unforgiving environment. The immediate search revealed troubling details that would haunt investigators for years to come. Isabella's favorite doll, a raggedy cloth figure named Rosita that she carried everywhere, was found abandoned near a cluster of barrel cacti approximately half a mile from the house. The doll showed no signs of damage or struggle, but its placement seemed deliberate rather than accidental. Her small footprints were visible in the sandy soil for about 200 yards before disappearing onto harder ground covered with loose gravel and scattered stones. Rex followed the scent trail to a dirt road that ran parallel to the Mexican border, where fresh tire tracks suggested a vehicle had stopped recently. Carmen's panic intensified as she realized that Isabella had never before abandoned her beloved doll willingly. The little girl had received Rosita as a gift from her grandmother before the elderly woman's death 2 years earlier. and the toy had become Isabella's constant companion and source of comfort during the difficult transition to desert life. Finding the doll discarded in the harsh landscape felt like discovering a piece of Isabella's soul left behind, and Carmen clutched it to her chest while Miguel expanded the search perimeter. The couple's initial search efforts were hampered by their unfamiliarity with proper search and rescue techniques. They called Isabella's name repeatedly, not realizing that their shouts might be frightening a lost child into hiding. They trampled potential evidence while following false trails created by desert animals, and their growing panic made it difficult to think clearly about where Isabella might have gone. By the time they called law enforcement, precious hours had been lost, and the brutal afternoon heat had made survival increasingly unlikely for a small child without water or shelter. By evening, the Pima County Sheriff's Department had mobilized the largest search operation in the region's history. Sheriff Patricia Williams personally oversaw the deployment of resources that included mounted patrol units, all-terrain vehicles, and helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras. The search teams were comprised of local law enforcement officers, border patrol agents familiar with the terrain, and volunteers from search and rescue organizations throughout southern Arizona. The operation faced significant challenges from the beginning, as the vast search area encompassed hundreds of square miles of some of the most difficult terrain in North America. The FBI joined the investigation within 48 hours, bringing federal resources and expertise in child abduction cases. Special Agent Rebecca Stone, who specialized in crimes involving missing children along the southwestern border, established a command center at the Cruz Ranch and began coordinating with Mexican authorities who might encounter Isabella if she had been taken across the international boundary. The Bureau's involvement signaled the serious possibility that Isabella had been kidnapped rather than simply lost in the desert, a development that brought both hope and terror to her desperate parents. Detective Laura Brennan, a seasoned investigator with 20 years of experience in missing persons cases, took charge of the local investigation. She had seen too many children vanish in the borderlands, some victims of human trafficking, others claimed by the unforgiving desert itself. But something about Isabella's disappearance felt different from typical cases. The evidence suggested both possibilities. The abandoned doll and footprints indicated she had walked away voluntarily, possibly chasing an animal or following someone she trusted. But the tire tracks and the strategic location near known smuggling routes suggested predators who knew exactly when and where to find a vulnerable child. The search continued for 3 grueling weeks, expanding to cover nearly 400 square miles of brutal terrain that tested the limits of human endurance. Volunteers from across Arizona and neighboring states joined the effort, bringing specialized equipment, including ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and drone aircraft, capable of accessing areas too dangerous for human searchers. The search teams operated primarily at dawn and dusk to avoid the deadly midday heat that regularly exceeded 115 degrees, but even these precautions couldn't prevent several volunteers from requiring medical treatment for heat exhaustion and dehydration. Carmen refused to leave the command post established in her front yard, surviving on coffee, energy bars, and the determination that only a mother's love could sustain. She maintained detailed logs of every search team's activities, created detailed maps marking areas that had been covered, and coordinated with media outlets to ensure Isabella's photograph remained visible throughout the Southwest. Her organizational skills and unwavering dedication became legendary among the volunteers, many of whom later credited her example with keeping them motivated during the most discouraging moments of the search. Miguel rode out with search parties every day until exhaustion forced him home, his intimate knowledge of the local terrain proving invaluable to teams unfamiliar with the area's hidden dangers and water sources. He guided searchers to remote canyons and caves that might provide shelter for a lost child, and identified animal trails that Isabella might have followed in her wandering. His expertise came at a personal cost, as each day of searching without results deepened his despair and guilt about his failure to protect his daughter. The community response was overwhelming, with local businesses donating food, water, and equipment, while churches organized prayer vigils that continued around the clock. The Yuma Community Foundation established a fund to support the search efforts and provide financial assistance to the Cruz family, whose ranch work had essentially stopped during the crisis. Local restaurants prepared thousands of meals for volunteers, while gas stations provided free fuel for search vehicles and aircraft. The solidarity demonstrated by the community provided some comfort to Isabella's parents, but couldn't fill the growing void left by their daughter's absence. Border Patrol agents familiar with the area's smuggling routes offered their expertise, explaining how criminal organizations use the remote desert highways to move drugs and human cargo between Mexico and distribution points throughout the American Southwest. Agent Carlos Ruiz, a 20-year veteran of border enforcement, described a sophisticated network of safe houses, hidden caches, and corrupt officials that made law enforcement efforts particularly challenging. He explained that children were especially vulnerable because they could be easily manipulated and were valuable to traffickers who specialized in forced labor and sexual exploitation. The agents' briefings revealed disturbing statistics about child disappearances in border regions, where federal agencies estimated that hundreds of minors vanished each year without adequate investigation or media attention. Many of these children were undocumented immigrants whose families feared contact with authorities. But American citizens like Isabella were also at risk from criminals who recognized that isolated rural areas provided ideal hunting grounds for predators seeking vulnerable victims. Local news stations picked up the story within hours of Isabella's disappearance, broadcasting her photograph across the Southwest and into Mexico through Spanish-language networks that reached millions of viewers. Her school picture showed a gap-toothed smile and bright brown eyes that seemed to sparkle with mischief, and the image quickly became iconic as it appeared on missing person flyers posted in every gas station, restaurant, and community center from Tucson to San Diego. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children added her case to their database, and her parents appeared on national television programs, pleading for any information about their daughter. The media attention brought both tremendous help and unexpected harassment. Legitimate volunteers swelled the search teams, while trained bloodhounds and their handlers arrived from neighboring states to assist in the ground operations. Professional search and rescue organizations donated equipment and expertise worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, including sophisticated communication systems that allowed searchers to coordinate across the vast operational area. Television coverage generated thousands of tips from viewers who thought they might have seen Isabella or witnessed suspicious activity in the region. However, the publicity also attracted psychics claiming supernatural visions of Isabella's location, amateur investigators armed with metal detectors and conspiracy theories, and cruel pranksters who called in false sightings that sent desperate parents racing across multiple states. Detective Brennan assigned additional personnel specifically to handle the flood of tips, but the sheer volume of information made it difficult to identify potentially valuable leads among the false alarms and deliberate misinformation. Each dead end deepened the family's anguish and strained the resources of law enforcement agencies already overwhelmed by border-related crimes. As days turned to weeks, the searchers found disturbing evidence of the desert's harsh reality and its history of claiming human lives. They discovered the remains of other missing persons, migrants who had perished attempting illegal crossings, and the decades-old bones of previous disappearance victims whose cases had never been solved. A shallow grave revealed the skeletal remains of a young woman who had been missing for 5 years, providing closure for another family while reminding everyone involved of the stakes in Isabella's case. These discoveries served as grim reminders of the desert's capacity for concealing secrets and the urgency of finding Isabella before she became another unsolved mystery. The search teams also uncovered evidence of extensive criminal activity in the region, including abandoned vehicles used by smugglers, hidden caches of drugs and weapons, and the remains of temporary camps used by human trafficking operations. This evidence provided valuable intelligence to federal agencies investigating border crimes, but offered no clues about Isabella's specific fate. The revelation that the Cruz family had been living in the midst of such criminal activity added another layer of complexity to the investigation and raised questions about whether Isabella's disappearance was random or targeted. Detective Brennan interviewed everyone who had any connection to the Cruz family, no matter how remote or seemingly insignificant. She questioned ranch hands, delivery drivers, utility workers, and even tourists who had stopped for gas in the area during the previous month. The investigation revealed that Miguel had once worked construction in Phoenix and had briefly been employed by a contractor later linked to money laundering operations. This connection prompted extensive background checks and surveillance that ultimately led nowhere, but consumed valuable time and resources while raising uncomfortable questions about the family's possible involvement in their daughter's disappearance. The intense scrutiny of the Cruz family created additional stress during an already unbearable situation. Investigators examined their financial records, interviewed their friends and neighbors, and analyzed their communications for any sign of criminal connections or suspicious activity. While these procedures were standard in missing child cases, they felt like accusations to grieving parents who were already blaming themselves for their daughter's disappearance. The investigation cleared the family of any wrongdoing, but the process left emotional scars that would take years to heal. Carmen and Miguel's relationship began showing signs of strain as they processed their grief differently and struggled with the constant media attention and investigative pressure. Grief counselors explained that the disappearance of a child often destroyed marriages as parents struggled with guilt, blame, and the impossible stress of not knowing whether to mourn or maintain hope. Miguel began drinking heavily, spending entire nights riding through the desert with a flashlight and a bottle of whiskey, calling Isabella's name into the darkness while Rex trotted alongside, both man and dog searching for a ghost. Carmen threw herself into organizing search efforts and media appearances, maintaining a public facade of strength while privately battling depression and anxiety that required prescription medication to manage. She contacted other parents of missing children, learning from their experiences and building networks of support that helped her navigate the complex landscape of law enforcement agencies, victim services organizations, and media relations. Her advocacy work began even before Isabella's case was resolved, as she recognized the need for better coordination and resources in missing child investigations. The search officially scaled back after a month, though it never completely ended. Most volunteers returned to their normal lives, but a core group of dedicated searchers continued weekend operations for several more months. Miguel continued riding into the desert every weekend, following animal trails and exploring remote canyons that the organized searches might have missed. He developed an encyclopedic knowledge of the terrain, mapping every cave, ravine, and water source within a 50-mile radius of their home. His solitary searches became both a form of therapy and a source of additional guilt, as he worried that his individual efforts might be inadequate compared to the massive organized operation that had failed to find Isabella. Carmen maintained a vigil at their kitchen window, watching the horizon with desperate hope that bordered on madness, convinced that Isabella would eventually find her way home if someone was always watching for her return. She kept Isabella's room exactly as it had been on the morning of her disappearance, with toys arranged precisely where the little girl had left them and clothes laid out for a homecoming that seemed increasingly unlikely. Neighbors worried about Carmen's mental state, but her determination to maintain hope became a source of inspiration for other families facing similar tragedies. The first anniversary of Isabella's disappearance brought renewed media attention and a temporary resurgence in tips and leads that investigators dutifully pursued despite their diminishing hope for success. An age-progressed photograph created by FBI specialists showed what Isabella might look like at 9 years old, but the computer-generated image felt hollow to her parents, a digital ghost that bore little resemblance to their vibrant, living daughter. The FBI increased their reward offer to $50,000 for information leading to Isabella's recovery, funded by donations from sympathetic citizens across the country who had followed the story through news reports and social media campaigns. Carmen became a prominent advocate for missing children, learning to navigate the complex bureaucracy of law enforcement agencies, victim services organizations, and legislative committees. She testified before Congress about the need for better coordination between federal agencies investigating cross-border crimes, and worked with other parents to establish support networks for families facing similar tragedies. Her advocacy resulted in improved protocols for missing child investigations and additional funding for search and rescue operations. But these victories felt hollow without news of her own daughter. The advocacy work provided structure to days that might otherwise have been consumed by despair, but it couldn't fill the Isabella-shaped hole in Carmen's heart or answer the questions that haunted her sleep. She became an expert on human trafficking patterns, border security issues, and the bureaucratic obstacles that often hindered missing person investigations. Her testimony before legislative committees was compelling and well-informed, helping to pass legislation that improved coordination between agencies and provided additional resources for families of missing children. As 2010 became 2011, then 2012, Isabella's case joined the growing file of cold cases that Detective Brennan kept on her desk, reviewing monthly for overlooked clues or new angles of investigation. The detective had children of her own and couldn't shake the image of Carmen Cruz standing in her doorway each morning, scanning the empty desert for a miracle that seemed increasingly unlikely to occur. New technologies emerged regularly: improved DNA analysis, facial recognition software, database cross-referencing systems. But none yielded the breakthrough that might solve Isabella's case. The Cruz family's ranch became a pilgrimage site for other families of missing children. Parents traveled from across the United States to share their stories and offer support, creating an informal network of those touched by similar tragedies. These gatherings provided some comfort, but they also served as painful reminders of how common such disappearances had become. The visitors brought news of other cases, some solved through persistence and luck, others destined to remain mysteries that would torment families for decades. Carmen organized annual memorial events that drew hundreds of participants from across the Southwest, creating a community of support for families dealing with missing children cases. These gatherings featured speakers from law enforcement agencies, victim services organizations, and other families who had survived similar ordeals. The events raised awareness about missing children issues and generated donations for search and rescue operations, but they also served as painful reminders of the countless families whose lives had been shattered by unexplained disappearances. Miguel grew increasingly isolated, spending entire days riding fence lines and checking water sources for their small herd of cattle. Neighbors worried about his mental state as they observed him talking to empty air, carrying on conversations with Isabella as if she were still there beside him. The desert had always been harsh, but now it felt actively malevolent, a vast predator that had consumed his daughter and left him to wander its edges like a broken ghost. His relationship with Carmen became strained as they processed their grief differently, each feeling abandoned by the other's coping mechanisms. The couple's financial situation deteriorated as medical bills mounted from Carmen's treatment for depression and anxiety, and Miguel's ability to maintain the ranch declined due to his obsessive searching and increasing alcohol consumption. Carmen worked part-time at a victim services organization in Yuma, while Miguel sold off portions of their land to developers planning retirement communities for snowbirds fleeing harsh northern winters. The irony wasn't lost on them. Their daughter had vanished in one of the most inhospitable environments in North America, yet wealthy retirees were eager to build dream homes in the same unforgiving landscape. Local folklore began incorporating Isabella's story, with some claiming her spirit still roamed the desert, helping other lost souls find their way to safety. These tales provided no comfort to her parents, who wanted their flesh and blood daughter back, not legends or supernatural consolation. The spiritual explanations felt like another form of abandonment, as if society was ready to transform Isabella into mythology rather than continue the difficult work of searching for the truth. Carmen actively discouraged such stories, insisting that Isabella was still alive and would someday return home. By 2015, Detective Brennan had retired after 30 years of service, though she passed Isabella's case file to her successor with strict instructions to pursue any new leads aggressively. The new detective, Thomas Park, brought fresh eyes to the investigation, but found himself facing the same frustrating lack of physical evidence that had stymied his predecessor. He spent months reviewing every interview, re-examining every piece of evidence, and following up on tips that had been set aside during the initial investigation's chaotic early days. Detective Park implemented new investigative techniques that had been developed since Isabella's disappearance, including advanced computer modeling to predict possible travel routes and destination points for vehicles that might have taken Isabella from the area. He coordinated with international law enforcement agencies, particularly in Mexico, where some experts believed Isabella might have been taken by human traffickers operating along the porous border. These investigations led to the rescue of other missing children and the arrest of several criminal operators, but brought no news of Isabella, leaving her parents trapped in an endless cycle of hope and disappointment. The case had been featured on several true crime television shows, generating thousands of tips that investigators dutifully pursued, despite their diminishing expectations. The shows brought Isabella's story to national audiences and kept public attention focused on her case, but they also generated conspiracy theories that ranged from the plausible to the absurd. Some viewers became convinced that the Cruz family had been involved in their daughter's disappearance, while others developed elaborate theories about government cover-ups or supernatural explanations for her vanishing. Detective Park found himself spending considerable time debunking false theories and following leads generated by television viewers who had become amateur investigators. While most of these tips were well-intentioned, they consumed resources and distracted from more promising avenues of investigation. The detective learned to quickly identify credible information while politely dismissing the more outlandish theories that television exposure inevitably generated. The 6th anniversary brought unexpected developments when advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to re-examine evidence collected during the original search. Traces of Isabella's DNA were found on clothing fragments discovered 2 miles from the ranch house, but the degraded condition of the samples made it impossible to determine when they had been deposited or whether they indicated the direction of her travel. The discovery renewed hope briefly, but follow-up investigations using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs yielded no additional clues. Carmen had aged dramatically during the years of uncertainty. her once dark hair now streaked with premature grey, and her hands permanently stained with the ink from countless missing person flyers. She had become the unofficial spokesperson for missing children in Arizona, testifying before legislative committees and organizing annual awareness events that drew hundreds of participants from across the Southwest. Her advocacy work had resulted in improved coordination between law enforcement agencies and better resources for families facing similar crises, but these victories felt hollow without news of her own daughter. The legislative victories that Carmen helped achieve included the passage of state laws requiring faster activation of Amber Alerts, improved coordination between agencies investigating cross-border crimes, and additional funding for search and rescue operations in remote areas. She worked with technology companies to develop better systems for disseminating information about missing children, and collaborated with victim services organizations to provide better support for families dealing with similar tragedies. Detective Park continued his investigation with methodical determination, using new technologies and databases that hadn't existed during the original search. He maintained contact with law enforcement agencies throughout North and Central America, sharing Isabella's information and photographs with officers who might encounter her during routine operations. The detective also worked with non-profit organizations that specialized in combating human trafficking, providing Isabella's details to social workers and investigators who worked with rescued victims. The breakthrough that would change everything began with a routine immigration raid at a textile factory in Vancouver, Canada, on March 18, 2024, 15 years after Isabella's disappearance. Canadian authorities were investigating reports of worker exploitation at the facility, which employed dozens of immigrants in conditions that violated both labor laws and human rights standards. The raid was part of a larger operation targeting businesses suspected of using trafficked labor, a growing problem that authorities had been tracking across multiple provinces. Among the workers discovered during the raid was a group of women who appeared to be living in substandard housing, provided by their employers, and working excessive hours for below minimum wages. Many of these women lacked proper documentation and showed signs of psychological trauma consistent with trafficking victims. Canadian immigration officers began the standard process of fingerprinting and photographing all individuals found at the site, preparing to determine their legal status and eligibility for victim services. One young woman in particular caught the attention of investigators because of her obvious fear of authority figures and her reluctance to provide basic information about her identity or origins. She claimed to be named Maria Santos and spoke fluent Spanish with what linguists later identified as a Mexican accent overlaying childhood patterns consistent with Southwestern American English. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with dark hair and brown eyes that bore a striking resemblance to someone investigators couldn't quite place. The woman's fingerprints were processed through multiple databases as part of standard immigration procedures, but it was a routine check against the FBI's missing persons database that generated the hit that would shock investigators on both sides of the border. The prints matched those taken from Isabella Cruz's bedroom 15 years earlier, when hope for her safe return had seemed reasonable and the investigation was focused on finding a lost little girl rather than solving a complex international crime. Detective Park received the notification call at 6:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that would forever divide the Cruz family's life into before and after. The initial information was preliminary and required careful verification, but the fingerprint match was strong enough to warrant immediate investigation. Park had delivered enough devastating news to families over the years to recognize when hope might be justified, and something about this case felt different from the false alarms that had tormented the Cruz family for over a decade. The notification process required delicate handling, as premature hope could prove more cruel than continued uncertainty. Park spent the morning coordinating with Canadian authorities and FBI specialists to confirm the identification before approaching Isabella's parents. The detective drove to the ranch personally, arriving as Carmen was feeding chickens in the dusty yard where Isabella had played on the morning of her disappearance. The familiar routine of caring for the animals had provided Carmen with some stability during the darkest periods of the past 15 years. And she continued this daily ritual even when hope seemed futile. Park's expression conveyed both caution and barely contained excitement as he explained the situation to Carmen and Miguel, watching their faces cycle through disbelief, hope, and terror in rapid succession. The detective had learned to manage families' expectations during his years of investigating cold cases, but this situation was unprecedented in his experience. The possibility that Isabella was not only alive, but had been found in such an unexpected location challenged everything the investigation had assumed about her disappearance. Miguel was more skeptical than his wife, having been disappointed too many times by promising leads that ultimately led nowhere. He listened to Park's explanation with the weary resignation of someone who had learned to protect himself from optimism through years of false hopes and cruel disappointments. But when the detective showed him enlarged photographs of the young woman found in Vancouver, something shifted in Miguel's expression. The eyes were familiar, carrying a spark of recognition that transcended the physical changes wrought by 15 years of separation and trauma. The DNA comparison process took several agonizing days, during which the Cruz family existed in a state of suspended animation between hope and despair. Carmen found herself unable to eat or sleep, alternating between frantic activity and paralyzed stillness as she waited for confirmation of what seemed too miraculous to believe. Miguel maintained his skeptical stance publicly, while privately allowing himself to imagine the impossible. That his little girl had somehow survived 15 years in captivity and was finally coming home. The DNA results confirmed what the photographs and fingerprints suggested. The young woman rescued from the trafficking operation was indeed Isabella Cruz, now 23 years old and bearing the psychological scars of unimaginable experiences. The confirmation came on a Friday afternoon, delivered through a phone call that left Carmen sobbing on her kitchen floor while Miguel stood frozen in their doorway, unable to process the magnitude of what they had just learned. Canadian authorities revealed that Isabella had been held in a network of safe houses and illegal facilities stretching from the Arizona-Mexico border to Vancouver's immigrant communities. She had been moved frequently to prevent her from forming lasting attachments or understanding her geographic location. Her captors had convinced her that her parents had abandoned her, selling her to pay off debts accumulated through drug trafficking, a lie that had shaped her understanding of her own identity for 15 years. The trafficking organization's scope horrified even experienced investigators who had spent careers combating such crimes. Isabella had been one of hundreds of children moved through a pipeline that stretched from Central America through Mexico and into both the United States and Canada. Her captors had specialized in taking children young enough to have their memories manipulated and their identities reshaped, creating a workforce of individuals who didn't understand they had been stolen from families who loved them. Isabella's rescue revealed the sophisticated methods used by the trafficking network to control their victims and evade law enforcement detection. Children were typically held in rural locations for several months while their appearances were altered and their memories manipulated through a combination of psychological abuse, isolation, and false information about their origins. They were then moved through a series of safe houses, each operated by different cells of the organization to prevent any single arrest from compromising the entire operation. The children were taught new languages, given false identities, and gradually integrated into criminal enterprises as they aged. Girls were often forced into domestic servitude or sexual exploitation, while boys were typically used for manual labor or drug trafficking operations. The organization's leaders understood that children who had been taken young enough would eventually accept their false identities as reality, making them less likely to attempt escape or seek help from authorities. Isabella's specific case revealed particularly cruel tactics used by her captors to ensure her compliance and prevent her from seeking help. She had been told that her parents had been killed in a car accident shortly after selling her, and that she was now alone in the world except for the criminal organization that claimed to be caring for her. These lies were reinforced through fake newspaper clippings and fabricated stories that made Isabella believe her captivity was actually a form of protection. The logistics of reunion proved almost as complicated as the original investigation. Isabella, who still insisted on being called Maria, had no memory of her life before captivity and had been conditioned to distrust authority figures who claimed to be helping her. She spoke primarily Spanish and Portuguese, with only fragments of English remaining from her childhood. Trauma counselors warned that forced reunification could cause additional psychological damage, recommending a gradual approach that prioritized Isabella's mental health over her parents' desperate need for closure. Carmen and Miguel flew to Vancouver with Detective Park, their first trip outside Arizona in 15 years. The reunion took place in a sterile conference room at a victim services facility, supervised by social workers and translators who monitored every interaction for signs of distress. Isabella sat rigidly in her chair, studying her parents' faces with the analytical detachment of someone who had learned to evaluate every situation for potential threats. The young woman before them bore little resemblance to the laughing 8-year-old who had chased roadrunners through the desert 15 years earlier. Isabella was thin to the point of frailty, with scars on her hands and arms that spoke of hard labor and harsh treatment. Her eyes held the guarded wariness of someone who had survived by trusting no one, and she flinched when Carmen reached out to touch her face. The physical reunion that the Cruz family had dreamed about for 15 years was replaced by the careful choreography of trauma-informed interaction protocols. Isabella's recovery would clearly be measured in years rather than months, requiring intensive therapy to address complex PTSD, identity confusion, and the learned helplessness that often affects long-term trafficking victims. She had been told so many lies about her origins that the truth felt like another manipulation, and she struggled to believe that these desperate strangers were actually her parents. The Spanish she spoke was flavored with words and phrases from multiple regions, evidence of the geographic scope of her captivity and the international nature of the criminal network that had stolen her childhood. The story that shocked the world wasn't just about Isabella's miraculous survival. It was about the thousands of other children who remained trapped in similar circumstances, invisible victims of a criminal industry that treated human beings as commodities to be bought, sold, and discarded. Isabella's case had become a window into a hidden world that most people preferred not to acknowledge, forcing uncomfortable conversations about the systems that allowed such crimes to flourish. Carmen and Miguel returned to Arizona with the knowledge that their daughter was alive, but faced the heartbreaking reality that she might never again be truly theirs. The 8-year-old who had vanished in the desert had become a stranger who spoke a different language and carried experiences too terrible for her parents to fully comprehend. Their joy at her survival was complicated by grief for the childhood that had been stolen and uncertainty about whether meaningful relationships could be rebuilt across such a vast chasm of trauma and time. The desert that had seemed to swallow their daughter whole had ultimately given her back to them, transformed but alive, carrying within her the promise that even the darkest mysteries could sometimes yield to persistence, hope, and the unbreakable bonds of family love that transcend time, distance, and unimaginable suffering.